Hello and welcome to today's PanelCast event. The topic of today's event is how data is changing the face of IT. My name is David Davis from Actual Tech Media, and I'm honored to be the moderator for today's event. Today's event is brought to you by Nutanix and Western Digital, and I'm excited to have our two presenters on the event today, Greg and Junan, who I'll introduce here in just a moment, but just a few slides to help us get started. The first one is just a little bit of housekeeping here. First off, we want this to be a very educational event, so we encourage you to use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll be doing my best to monitor the questions box throughout the event, so as live questions come in, I'll pose them to today's expert panelists. We'll also have 3 Amazon $100 gift cards to announce at the end of the event, so make sure you stay tuned for that announcement. And I also want to point out that we have a couple of handouts available for download there in the GoToWebinar control panel, one from Nutanix and one from Western Digital. So make sure that you don't forget to download those assets as well, because they'll give you some additional information on today's topic. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce today's panelists. First off, we have Junan Lanigan, Global Head of Enterprise Data Management at Western Digital. And we have Greg White, Solutions Marketing Program Manager at Nutanix. Junan and Greg, thank you so much for being on the event today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So let's kick it off with a little bit of what you do and maybe what your background is. Junan, why don't you start?
Sure, thanks, and I really appreciate being here. It's going to be great. So I just want to know, are the gift cards for the best question or the best answer?
Randomly selected.
Randomly picked. Okay, so as David said, I lead global enterprise data management at Western Digital, and in context here, what that means is for the corporation, I run all of data architecture, data governance, which includes master data management and data quality, data stewardship, all those things, as well as enterprise performance management, which is your more traditional data warehousing, BI, planning and reporting applications. And then our big data platform, which is catered to our product development, engineering, and manufacturing teams. So that's what I do.
Okay, great. Greg?
Yeah, so I sit in our product and solutions organization. I'm focused on the solution side of things, helping customers and potential customers think about ways that they can better solve how they run their workloads and provide IT in specific use cases, whether that's remote office, whether that's running SAP, whether that's doing virtual desktops, just kind of making sure that they're able to do those workloads that are important for driving their business.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both for being here. And I'll try to focus, just for the audience, I'll try to focus my focus on my camera most of the time, but I may look down here to the questions panel to see what's going on there as well. So without further ado, I want to mention that we did get like hundreds of questions for this event as submitted by the audience. And I've gone through and tried to select some of the best questions with the help of Junan and Greg. And so we'll start by focusing on those questions. And there were some really, really great questions. It was tough to pick the best ones, but we've got the top 12 questions here, as well as maybe some bonus questions, we'll see. But we highly encourage questions from the audience during the event. So please feel free to use the questions box there and ask some questions. Now, before I start with the first questions, I've got just a few little introductory slides here. And so the theme of this event, of course, is data. And you've probably heard the phrase, data is the new gold. And we in IT, we have to look at ourselves as the miners of that, if you will, or maybe not the miners so much, but at least the caretakers of that data. So, it's our job to make sure that the data is always available. That's really the expectation today of our end users, our customers, is they always need access to the data all the time. It doesn't seem like there's any more downtime, these days. There's very few maintenance periods that are welcomed by today's end users. We have to protect that data with, data protection, on-site, off-site, disaster recovery. We have to secure that data, which is becoming tougher and tougher to do, and always make sure that it performs, which is also challenging with, the massively growing data sets that we're faced with today. And that data is also not only massively growing, but also distributed in many cases, across multiple data centers in the cloud, maybe multiple clouds, maybe, SaaS applications. And we have malicious attackers at the same time trying to get at that data from any point they can to steal the data, to ransom it. So it's our job to, ensure that data is secure and always ensure that it's protected, and that's tougher and tougher to do. And the very first question we have here has to deal with those massively growing data sets. And so I'll start off by handing this to Greg. Greg, how do you deal with massively growing distributed data sets? What's your recommendation?
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the history of IT and how businesses have run. We started with this whole human-generated data, and then we've progressed more into machine-generated data, analysis of that human data, of things like GPS, location, all this that, kind of took that to another notch. And now we're seeing that start again, build on top of that even with IoT data. And so there's no way that you can have a static kind of solution to be able to adapt to the way things are changing and growing. And so really being able to have a flexible architecture, something that you can grow incrementally in different ways for different types of data as well as different locations. And I think ultimately there's going to be more of things like machine learning and AI that are going to help with the management of that data. So understanding how that could play into how you're going to manage that data growth. And then finally, I think one of the big things that is important when dealing with this is thinking about how you can summarize or condense or kind of break down data where it's collected before, we used to try and all move it to one place and then use it. So I think there needs to be more of that intelligent reduction and summarizing, at the edge in place. And so that's going to help adapt to that massive growth as well. So it's just a few of the things. Yeah.
Okay, great feedback. Thank you. Jean-Ann.
Yeah, we've seen tremendous amount of growth in our data. The data I'm talking about primarily is the parametric and test data that's coming off of all of our factories, right? So we manufacture hard disk drives and solid state drives, and we are in multiple factories, but we need to get all that data together to have one view of a drive. And so we're storing about 9 petabytes of data right now, and collectively. And so we stream, about 6 terabytes of data a day into one collective store. And what we've found is that object storage is the answer for us there, is that, like a public cloud, we also use object storage on premise so that we can store, and we're storing like 10 years worth of data there. But then we can be selective about the cloud, the data that we send to the cloud. So it's kind of the S3 to S3 compatible. But we definitely see that object storage is the answer for us as far as, that data just continues to grow, not only on the number of tests, but the number of drives, the volumes, and the number of new products. So we just anticipate that it will get even more massive than it is today.
Very cool. 9 petabytes. That's a lot of data. Let me just throw this out there for you, Jean-Ann. I mean, how does someone know in an IT organization, how do they know when they need an object store? At what point, or is there a certain amount of data or a certain type of data that they would need an object store?
Yeah, in our case, it was really a matter of being able to selectively move the data from one place to another, right? So to know that we could bring all this data into one location, as I call it, our golden copy, right? Because if you think about it, when you move data to the cloud, it's very expensive, right? And there's a lot of latency in that process as well. So the object store allowed us to speak between an on-prem and a cloud environment, and literally only have to share the data into the cloud that is necessary for the duration of analytics. So if people want to do analytics over a 2-year time frame, we're only storing 2 years worth of data in the cloud. However, if through that object store, if somebody wants to do an analysis for 3 years or more, we have a way to do on demand. And so we can go grab the data and bring it back. So it's all being cycled through that object storage.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, yeah, that question just popped into my head while you were talking there. So I thought that would be interesting to learn about. So the next question here is about AI and ML, and there was at least a dozen questions, maybe 20 even, related in some way to AI and ML that we received from the audience. And so this is kind of a multi-part question you can see here. And it's, what does AI and ML really mean to you and IT? Because I know it means so many different things to different people. And do you really see AI and ML being used? And how can it help with data challenges? So let's start with you, Junan.
Sure. I think that this is definitely a journey. It's a journey for the business, which drives then a journey in your data strategy and a journey in your data architecture, right? But when I started with the company 5.5 years ago, but this was an original IBM company. So people have been doing SAS models and, SPSS and JUMP and all of these statistical models for a very long time on small data sets. And so, that's great, but we realized they only have the visibility to based on the data that they had. And so part of our strategy is if we bring all this data together, they'll have more access to more data to do more analysis. And it was through then that they started evolving kind of their understanding of the data and the problems that they can solve. So the business is actually evolving and actually leading us through what is the next generation, what's the next stage. And so through machine learning, we're able to then leverage the volume and velocity of the data in the cloud to train models that then we can insert directly into the stream of data on-prem. And so we ourselves are getting much more sophisticated at that, but it is a journey. It's not like the whole company knows how to do machine learning at one time, right? You get very selected users who have the data science skills, but more the aptitude of the business and the aptitude of the processes to be able to know how to use machine learning, right, to actually make, to bring value, to actually make a difference, as opposed to it being an academic thing to do and just, let's run Python, let's do these kind of different scripts. We're actually trying to target it very specifically to the use cases of the business. And then it's those who learn will teach others. And so just, on that, over the last year, we've consolidated a lot of our analytics teams into one digital analytics office who are the more senior trained people in data science. And they actually know how to build applications then that enable other people to do machine learning modeling and take the hard part out of it, if you will, and make it a little bit more self-serve. So I definitely think it's here to stay. I actually think it also, as it says here, how does it help with your data challenges? The more people depend on your data, the more they're going to demand good quality data, which means we really need to understand who owns it and who manages it. And I think that's one of the next questions, so I won't go into that. But, if you're trying to make good decisions, you have to trust your data. So it's definitely pulling that maturity into the business as well.
Okay, so it really is being used today, but it's not some magical box that you can just throw the AI and ML on it and Siri gives some magical answers about your data. It takes a little bit of work and a little bit of learning.
It does, yes.
Okay, all right. Greg, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Junan said. I think that's really important to think about those specific projects and, buy off a little bit and get some success with it and then continue to build on it. I think the other thing that's interesting to think about and you will see out there and things I've seen is from the IT infrastructure side, this is coming into more and more products and solutions. And, even just from our perspective, we use machine learning to help drive planning and how our system works. And there have been forms of that sort of, in the past, tiering and some things like this intelligence of data tiering we would call AI or ML now today. But so I think you'll see it in products. But the last thing from an IT and data management perspective is thinking about how you can use AI, ML to better manage your data. Could you, I'm seeing tools where people are using AI to help with their data ingest and their data cleanup and data placement, so that then those LOB teams that are using that data, it's faster for them, or it's more efficient. They have, a better data set to work from. So you can see it both, from the line of business side, but also how IT is putting it to use too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I was just going to add to what Greg said that, lately we've been thinking about how do we, because we're streaming the data to, and actually applying the machine learning models, but how do we stream the data and in parallel evaluate the quality of it in context of that model? So, the data is good, but is the data good in context of this model, right? So I think it adds a new dimension to even data quality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it can be used both by the line of business as well as in the IT infrastructure side to make intelligent decisions about the data. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So next question here. If we're developing a data architecture for the enterprise, what are the things that we should keep in mind? Greg?
Yeah. I think about it as there's a few key things or layers that are a part of that. You need the ability to support different types of data, whether it's NoSQL or relational databases or files or objects, being able to have, because now the diversity of data is so big, you don't want to have that all be different kinds of different platforms or architectures, right? So that's a big part of it. Ensuring that the data is protected and recoverable and secure, have that built in is a key element of a data architecture. Having the tools on top so that teams that aren't a part of the infrastructure can leverage it in better ways. So automation tools, self-service tools, how could I get some infrastructure provisioned very easily and quickly, having that kind of built into your platform. Especially also having that ability to grow and expand very easily. You don't have to predict what you're going to be 5 years from now with your architecting, but being able to adapt and grow. And then I think lastly is having the tailored services on top of that can then go be put to work by the LOB, even beyond the infrastructure teams. And having that all be flexible and being able to show a demonstratable, ROI to it. But I think those are kind of the key things that go into that data architecture that are going to be critical for success.
Okay, great feedback. Junann, what have you done around data?
Greg said. Yeah, I was going to say, I would agree with everything Greg said. It would almost be my script, the same. I mean, you have to think about, first of all, you have to understand the business, but you have to understand what types of data. So, if you're talking about very structured data, that's one thing. If you're moving into sensors, if you're moving into images, so you need to understand what type of data we're talking about before you can decide what your data architecture is, right? And then you also look at how do we need to process that data? How do we need to store it? All the things that you talked about. And then, totally agree as well, how do you realize value? And that depends on how the business consumes the data. So some people want to consume it through reports and dashboards. Some people want an ad hoc. Some people want to do advanced analytics. Some people want to do machine learning, as we were just talking about. So we call it future proofing. So we look at our entire architecture and we place bets, right? When we think about even technologies, which technologies do we think are the best for that future that don't encumber us as well? So I typically try to stay away from platforms that make you bring all your data to something. I want something to come to my data, right? Because if I start moving my data to too many platforms, then I've lost the purpose. And then you have to think about the workloads themselves. So how do people want to consume that data? What's the latency requirement they have for that data? That's really key in looking at your data architecture, right? So if it's in the cloud, it's got a certain built-in latency to it versus somebody wants to stream that. So, you know, even architecting our own environment and ecosystem, we have big data and fast data. So big data is in the cloud and fast data is on premise. But all those things, I think, as Greg was saying, play into how you think about your data architecture today. But I think it's our job to be thinking about it in the future as far out as we can.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I didn't think about that. You want the data services to come to your data, not put your data, you know, split it in different places. That's interesting, a good perspective. Here's a question that came in from Luis, and either of you are welcome to answer it, or we can get back to him later. The question is, you know, we talked about quality and availability of our data. Do you have any advice on how to map security frameworks over the AI initiatives? Like what controls should be in place? Specifically, he works at an educational institution, he said. Any thoughts on that? Security frameworks around the data?
I don't know, Greg, I depend on our security architects to tell me how I have to build the firewalls in the cloud. And then I have to, you know, be restricted to those. But I think that, you know, maybe to that point, and not necessarily to the educational industry, but definitely when you're in the cloud, if you're in your virtual private network or even in a public, you really have to think about now how you need to architect your security around that data, such that nobody can get into that data that isn't, you know, welcome, let's say, but also how people are getting access to it and what data that they can get access to, even if they're allowed in. And then I think on-prem, it brings some even more or different kind of security requirements as well, because you think that that's all contained within, but you still have the opportunity through your network for people to get to that data. So you have to really think about your cybersecurities into your networks as well.
Yeah, great advice. Go ahead, Greg.
I was just going to add, and I hope this answers the question or adds some value to it as well, because I agree with what Julian was saying. But, you know, you've got several different layers. You've got your physical pieces that you need to be able to monitor, and AI and ML can play a place there, sorry, in the idea of using machine learning to continuously monitor a known good state for your physical configuration and being able to automatically adapt. And so you can play that out on the physical side and the infrastructure. And then, yeah, having really going back to the LOB and other teams, right? Who needs access and why, and really mapping that out ahead allows you to define those rules from then, you know, from the application and data access side, besides just the physical piece. So I think there are a couple different areas there, and the AI and ML plays into the monitoring of it and the ability to react faster.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind to me is, you know, role-based access control, and then the principle of least privilege. You know, what's the least privilege the person can get to, you know, access the data that they need to do their job. Next question here on the list, and this is kind of a long one. Should we design cloud solutions based on how the data is recorded, stored, and consumed for a particular business unit, or should it be a generic solution that's applicable to the whole company, and why? Junan?
Well, I think that you need to, when you say applied to the whole company, I think people have different needs for their data. And so some are going to need it as recorded, right, depending on how close they are to the data. Others are just going to be consumers of it, so you have to think about the most efficient way to store that. And cloud is definitely an option of how to store that data. But then there's also the on-premise. So for me, even if you design a cloud solution, you also need to think about hybrid. And I think a lot of people, ourselves included, initially we brought everything to the cloud because it was so disparate. And so the only way to actually manage that data and make value out of it was to bring it all together. But as we evolved and grew and then knew what to do with the data, it became more important to think about, well, now I need to apply those machine learning models, as I said, in the stream of data. So now I'm much closer to the data to store it, right? So I definitely think it's a hybrid, and it depends, going back to what's the business trying to do with it.
Yeah, that's a good question to start with. What's the business, reason behind it? Greg?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is you're gonna always have workloads that have different needs, and so you're gonna need to tailor, for those workloads. But what's important is that not be tailoring a unique platform to run it on. So being able to have a common underlying data architecture, like we talked about, that's flexible, that can be used in different ways, is really critical. You don't want the old way of where we've stood up a silo of this to do this workload and some different product and solution node to do this workload, and then do it a whole different way now in the public cloud. So I think it really is important where there may be some flexibility in the design for specific workloads to be a common data services platform or underpinning to all of that, so that you don't have, you don't just create a ton of management churn, and you should be able to scale with people where you use less effort as they get bigger, by having some of the intelligence and the management in a common plane of all that together.
Yeah, so it's not a one size fits all, an extra large shirt for everybody, but then it's also not just customized data architectures and solutions for every business application or unit. I think I'm hearing you say try to find kind of the middle ground.
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing that we've implemented, so I've been very focused in our conversation about big data, but we've also implemented a cloud ERP system. And one of the things that we're moving away from is loading the data into our data warehouse every 8 hours, right? Because that's kind of the traditional, but instead actually creating a replica. So not an ODS per se, but a replica of that data, and stream that into our data warehouse, so that, it's a 20-minute delay, but that's a whole different paradigm shift for people to do analytics off a traditional data warehousing and get refreshed data that quickly. And that's serving a need, right, for people, because we don't want to report against that ERP cloud environment. It's very costly for licenses and what have you. But if we can get the data to them as quickly as possible, it'll satisfy 80% of the use cases.
Okay, nice. I like that. Let's see, we're about halfway through here, and we're on question 5. We're doing good, making good progress through these. Next question on the list: who really manages the data of a company? Is there a data single person? How does that typically work? What have you seen in the real world? Greg, I think it's your turn.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of a couple key, I don't think you can say any one person really owns it. I think what I see now and really develop, it used to kind of be IT drove the show on that, but I think they're key stakeholders, and it's increasingly that the application architects, the application owners of that line of business have a much bigger, not say, but have a better voice at the table with IT, and what I'm seeing is a lot more collaboration, and where IT owns the execution and can help drive the strategy to meet the needs of the architects and LB that don't really, may not always understand the technology, or may not, even really care what the technology is. They just want, a specific outcome. And so I think it's those two groups really working together to drive that is what I'm seeing a lot more collaboration, a lot more focus from both sides on measuring those business outcomes so that they can prioritize and the projects that they're doing and modernize the organization, but in chunks in the way that are going to make the most impact right away. So.
Okay. So IT is protecting the data and making it highly available and performant, and then the lines of business are managing maybe the application, the data structure, and the architecture, and then the two kind of work together. Is that
Yeah, that's a lot of what I see, and I see IT really bringing some new strategies and ideas on how they can change the experience that the line of business has had in the past, and then getting that input on what it really does mean for the business, having a real tie to that business from that side.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Janan, what have you seen at Western Digital?
So within my organization as a data governance team, and I'm in IT, but there's only 5 people in that organization. And I say that because that means that we're not managing all data, right? It means that we're teaching people how to manage data. And the structure that we put in place is a framework around data governance that includes data stewardship and data governance and metadata management, et cetera. And our focus is really on teaching people how to be good stewards of the data. So it may be a customer data steward, or customer master data steward, or a product master data steward, or it could be somebody that owns specific engineering data. So we identified, I think we've got about 300 and something data stewards across the company who actually have that in their job titles. They are data stewards. But then there's, functional data stewards, domain data stewards, IT data stewards. And so we're really trying to drive a culture of everybody is accountable for the quality of our data. So in that, everybody plays a role with it, because you either create it or you produce it or you consume it. So everybody plays a role in that. And I'm going to just be proud here for a minute. Our Penang media factory, so media is part of a drive, just got our inaugural Data Quality Award because they've actually embedded data quality checks into every aspect of the manufacturing process. And so we've taught them how to measure data quality across that entire process, and they've seen the results and the yields of their product. And so we're showcasing that. We're making it pretty competitive with other factories, but that's at a factory level. But we're really trying to drive this culture of we all are accountable and own data quality, and therefore we all have to understand what our role is in data management and ownership of that. So far it's working, but it kind of has to catch on, right? It has to be truly embedded in your culture.
Yeah, I like that approach. I mean, it reminds me a lot of what, companies are trying to do around security, of course. I mean, just because you have, say, a chief security officer doesn't mean that everyone isn't responsible for security of the company's data. I mean, that one person or that one, little group can't just protect everyone's data like armed guards. It's really every person's responsibility to secure, the company's data. And like you're talking about there, with your group and the Western Digital philosophy, it's really everyone's responsibility to accurately manage and handle the data.
Right.
I like that. Okay. Cool. Well, I'm learning a lot. I bet the audience is as well. Let's see. Here's another question that came in. How open do you think the data sharing should be with other industry partners, competitors, and what to analyze to make a good decision? So the question is around data sharing. So, you have business partners at your respective companies and the companies you work with. How open have you seen data sharing, and how is it done in a secure way? Do you have any answers to that one, Greg?
Yeah, it varies a lot based on the industry and, regulation and compliance needs that are there, right? But what I do see a big rise in is this idea of really doing an assessment of the risk of sharing. And there are some models out there around sharing assessments of risk. And so that's really a way to put a framework around it so that then you can make the right kind of decisions. And I think that's important to have that going into it and understand your goals and what's the, we keep kind of coming back to what's the return on it. And so having a framework on how you can evaluate, your risk and what it means, and also having an understanding of, is the benefit, the return you're going to get then worth whatever risk you think you evaluated.
Yeah, I like that. Jean-Ann, do you want to chime in on that at all?
I'll just give a perspective because I agree with that. This might be a little bit different slant on it, and that's sharing data with customers. So again, to our drives, one of the, we want to get to the DNA of the drive, as we call it, meaning that I want to know everything about the drives themselves as we manufacture them. But we also want the data from the customer. So we get the field data of any bad things that happen, right? They share that data with us. But what's important is that we get all their data of what's happening in their environment with our drives, right? So we call it fleet health monitoring. So that, but in order to do that, one, you have to build trust, but the other is that you have to show value. So, if I give you access to all my data in my data center with your drives, what are you doing with that data to benefit me versus you're just, using that to benefit your next production or product line or what have you, right? So we do data sharing with several of our large customers, and I think it's making a big impact.
Yeah, I like that. Showing value and building trust. I mean, because more and more I see applications or websites, saying, would you like to participate in our, feedback program that automatically stores what you do and, sends it to us. And, there's some companies I say, yeah, I'd like to help them make a better product. And then other companies, you might not be so keen on, where you're like, no, I'm not going to help you. So building trust and then showing value. I mean, like, what do I get, by sharing that data? How's it really going to help me? I think those are important points that you make there.
And that's a great point. I would just add on to a similar perspective from our side as well. We have a thing called Pulse that you can turn on within Nutanix that sends data about what's going on in your environment, and we aggregate that and then can send out fixes faster. We recognize problems. We're doing AI and ML on that's coming back in, and customers really see value on that when they get a part shipped to their site that is something that hasn't failed yet, but we're suggesting replace it, so see that in the real world too. I love that idea of, showing that value.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what it reminds me of is, when I was an IT manager, having the SAN there back in those days, and the automated, call-ins when a drive was bad, and you wouldn't know about it until the guy showed up, on Monday morning and said, hey, a drive went bad and I brought it out to you, here you go. Let's replace it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wow, that's a great service. I love that kind of thing. So yeah, I think more companies, need to show that kind of value from their phone home or feedback or, whatever it might be. So moving on to the next question here, how can the cloud help deal with data and storage struggles? Jean-Ann, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. As I mentioned before, or I should go back, when we first started our big data journey, we actually outsourced to another cloud provider, to another company, because we didn't know what we were doing, honestly. What does it really mean to build out a big data platform in the cloud? And so we brought our data to them, all of our data to them. And then over time, I decided that it was time for us to have our own virtual private cloud and move our data there. But as we were talking about before, with the volumes of data, I mean, that's a real data struggle. Where do you store all of that data? Plus, we had 10 years of tapes in the factories, and needed to convert all that data, which created even more of a challenge of a data store. And so, as I was saying, what we decided to do was architect our pipelines to bring all of our data to our own product, which is called ActiveScale, in our Las Vegas data center, and store everything there, and then only publish to the cloud what we need. And one of the real drivers behind that is just the cost. The cost of storing your data in the cloud is quite enormous, and the cost of getting it out is even worse. And so you don't want to give them any more data than you need, because you're paying a storage cost on that side, on the cloud, and then the cost of getting your data out of cold storage or whatever you want to call it is very expensive too. So I think the cloud is great with helping, make sure that you have the data and the compute next to each other for the data that you need. But I think you really have to architect that whole, storage of your data strategy and think about how do you, by doing that also, by bringing all of our data to one location, that golden copy, it also allows us more flexibility that I could take my data and go to a different cloud provider if I wanted. So I'm not completely, tied, if you will, to any one cloud provider. So I think those are just strategies that you need to think through as you do try to manage through, the data and the storage struggles.
Yeah, great point. So the cloud's not a magic box. It could help in some certain, specific use cases, but you don't want to just dump all your stuff in the magic box because it has an expensive price tag associated with it. Greg, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think I like to talk to teams when I'm out in organizations about running a workload where it makes the most sense from a cost and latency and resource perspective, And the reason people, have really looked to the public cloud so profoundly, in the last few years is some of the benefits of things that were hard to accomplish in an on-prem situation, that ability to scale, very quickly in small chunks, not have to plan ahead for, everything you need for the next few years. And then having some unique tools that are up there that might be things that you'd have to purchase and deploy and bring on-prem. Like if you need some service that you only need for a short amount of time, that it was really attractive. But like Junan talked about, I see people realizing that it's not as cheap as they thought it was. There's a lot of things that you have to figure out and understand when you're architecting that to make it work right. And I think ultimately they're looking for that experience and then trying to make it work where it makes the most sense, just like Junan said. Where's that data collection happen? Where does the processing need to occur? Where does the output need to go? And designing and thinking about it in those terms instead of, if I put this here, it's cheaper, or if I put this here, it's more secure. There's those that can play into it, but I think there's a lot more to it.
Okay, yeah. So definitely analyze the ROI before putting anything in the cloud where you're going to have to pay based on consumption. Here's a question that just came in. Morgan is asking, what about data validity? How often should backup data be tested for data validity? Either one of you, Greg or Junan, have any thoughts on that?
I'll just throw out a couple things, and I bet Junan's got some good ideas too from the real world there. But when I talk to customers out there, it depends on the workload, and it depends on what the business objective is of that application. If it's your mission critical ERP, testing that validity of the data may need to be done on more like a weekly or a monthly basis, but if it's Exchange or something where you might do it like on a monthly basis. So I think talking to the business, understanding those rules is really help you define that. And then I think, collecting some best practices according to those types of workloads is what I've seen. Yeah.
Okay. Good advice. Junan?
I would just add to that, a practice that we have is we work with the business to understand how do they define validity, right? Because that's an attribute or a dimension of quality. So what does it mean to be valid, right? Does that mean that it's applicable, it's transactable, or does it mean it meets these specific business rules? And so, we've really automated a lot of business rules across the business, just not in engineering, manufacturing, but across the business. And then we are constantly running those business rules against the live data so that we've got dashboards to tell us, if we're starting to see any stray or issues with the data itself. And so I think a hard part is to get the business to really think about the logic that they apply when they are validating something to determine if it's valid. And so once we can get that understood, being able to create automatic scripts to run against the data really, and it's at whatever frequency is required, right? If something needs to be constantly monitored, we'll constantly monitor it, or it might be we're going to run these data quality checks every so often. So.
Okay, I like that. It depends a lot on the application and the use case. All right, cool. So next question that came in here, what's the most efficient way to handle the larger amounts of data? Greg?
Yeah, we've seen this. We've been facing this growing data challenge, and the architecture, the infrastructure that has been offered to address data storage and compute and running workloads is really evolving. And so you're seeing new technologies, the things that AWS, Google, the big cloud players are using, this idea of a web scale kind of architecture, you see is now something that can be run on-prem and be used in that way. So it's that idea of, to be able to handle the larger amounts of data, you need to be able to linearly scale up and down very easily. You can't do, like I talked about before, that idea of planning, for 5 years out from now. You need to have built-in capabilities that are going to help drive that efficiency. So do you have the built-in capabilities of compressing it and tiering it and managing it, simplifying it, having the intelligence on how you're going to manage it. You just can't dump it into one big pool and treat it all the same. So, and so that's kind of to wrap that up, that idea of understanding some value around the data as you're collecting it or as you use it, so that you know how and where to keep it, to be as efficient as possible and really reduce that management challenge. And so I think those are some of the things that are important for that, to be able to be successful with it.
Okay. That reminds me of something Jinan said earlier, metadata. So the data about the data, maybe we could use that to help us decide, how to handle these massive data sets. Jinan, what about you? What have you done at Western Digital?
I agree with all that. I think data people all see the same things, but as we were talking, one thing that did come to mind, and so maybe it applies, is that it all depends on what you're trying to do with it. So the large volume comes from what, right? So is it because at this particular point in time I need to process a large volume of data, or is it just that my data is growing and growing and growing, right? And I think Greg, you talked about that. Your data is growing, so you need to make decisions about how to store it. Another perspective of that is that the large volume of data is the volume I need right now, right? And so when you're in the cloud, being able to, really high performance compute and be able to expand very quickly to accommodate the processing of that very large data set, but then turning it back down again as well. So I think that's just another perspective of managing those large volumes of data, is how do you do it efficiently, and then how do you do it cost effectively as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure that's something a lot of companies have to deal with these days, is larger and larger data sets. So let's see, moving on here, question number 8. What are the most useful or productive or efficient gaining storage features or services to focus on outside of what's cool and what's hyped? So in the real world, I guess, what have you really seen from storage solutions that really make a difference? Jinan?
Yeah, I would say that one perspective on this is data durability, right? So how do I communicate that data is changing, right? And make that known throughout the organization. So I think we're seeing more and more around microservices to help with that, to proliferate the knowledge of the information of the data across your architecture. So I don't know if that's cool or hyped, but it's something I think is becoming our reality, is the complexity of our data, the volume of the data, the velocity of it, and the use of it is getting so proliferated that how do you keep it all in sync is becoming a big question for us anyway. And you know, Western Digital is creating tools and features that are allowing us to do that. So I get to be customer one within Western Digital. And so, you know, very excited that these new capabilities are being introduced so that we can figure out how we will use them as well.
Excellent, excellent. Greg?
Yeah, you know, similar to what I said earlier about some of the AI and ML pieces that can be used to help manage data and ingest and grow, just like Julian is talking about. What I'm also seeing is, you know, that consolidation of storage services. So that idea of, I don't need to have a separate file storage array. I don't need to have a separate block storage array and a separate object storage platform, but having a way to be able to have all those different kinds of data stored under a common architecture, a common platform. You know, just like kind of what you see in the public cloud, you can now get that sort of thing on premise as well. And then it enables that hybrid piece as well. But so being able to store different and manage different types of storage on the same platform is one, and then having those built-in services that are key to being more efficient about it. Some of the things I talked about earlier around compression and erasure coding and deduplication that are gonna, you know, they're kind of the bread and butter. They're not that sexy or hyped, but they're, you know, really important depending on the type of data. Obviously, some things are better with that than others, but those are the ones that I think have been proven and continue to be proven out, and then we'll see more of the tools and services continue to evolve.
Yeah, you make a great point. I mean, in the past, these kind of advanced storage features were often optional, a la carte, priced separately, or, you know, you would buy a separate box to do data duplication and another box to do acceleration over the WAN. And, you know, just like all these things now have been combined into, you know, they say table stakes features. You know, these are just features that every data solution out there or storage solution, you know, should have. So I like that. And that definitely improves efficiency and productivity. Let's see, we're starting to run out of time here. So maybe we should move to the lightning round. We didn't talk about that, but question 9.
Ding.
Right. Question 9, can or should companies implement hyperconvergence in a phased deployment? Greg?
Yeah, that is typically the way I see it done. The beauty of hyperconvergence is this idea of, you know, start small with a few nodes and then scale as you need more capacity. You need to do some sizing and understanding of your workload to make sure you've got the right mix of compute and storage into that deployment. But after you've done that, it's just as simple as moving VMs. It's really easy. And so what we typically see is a customer will pick one workload they want to start with. They get familiar, they move that, things work, and then it's just a matter of determining, okay, what's the next workload, and does that work? What does that workload need to be successful? How much compute, how much storage, and then I just incrementally add the capabilities for that, and just continue to kind of bite off workloads at a time is how we typically see it. So that phased-in approach, very successful, very easy, and it's very fast. It makes it really easy you don't have to boil the ocean, and you can see your results really quickly.
Okay, excellent. Julian?
Over the last year, we've implemented what we call our fast data. So the big data being in the cloud, fast data being on premise. And the approach that we took to that was that we would take ActiveScale and we would architect it such that it had kind of what we felt would be the right size, right, of storage, memory, and compute. And then we did just that. We put it into 4 of our factories and we said, okay, let's start doing piloted analytics projects and machine learning projects on this to see how they perform. And to, you know, it's actually testing out a lot of technologies that are in the self-service platform. But the idea being, let's size it big enough for, you know, some pretty robust value add analytics, but let's not overscale it, right? With the knowing that once people learn how to use it, then we'll start seeing, you know, what the real need is, and we'll take the next project and the next project and the next project, and we'll find that breaking point of where they're going over capacity, right? And so we'll understand what that is and learn ourselves how to manage that platform as effectively as possible. So it really is, you know, start with, as you were saying, start someplace, start with the projects that you think are going to add value, right? They'll be attractive because they actually will produce something, and then from there, just add on to it as you learn more.
Okay, great advice. And here's another question that came in. Do you have any recommendations for resources or tools or tips for comparing whether to put data in the cloud or to put it on premises? Greg?
Yeah, I have one that's got that I helped develop at Nutanix, actually, that compares workloads. It's a kind of a basic model, and I think if you go to nutanix.com/TCO, you should be able to find it there. But if not, I'm happy to share it. But it's just a paper that IDC wrote where they compared the two and put together a model that you could use to do that. It's tricky, you know. It's really hard to get apples to apples because there's a lot of services in the public cloud that you may not think at first, and typically a lot of people, it takes a little bit of time to figure that out. But yeah, that's one way of doing it, I think, that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, all right. So Jeananne, at Western Digital, when someone brings you a new app and says, we got all this data, you know, should we put it in the cloud or on-prem? How do you work through that?
Well, we don't have any white papers to share, but certainly have gone through our own assessment of, especially in the beginning, looking at, you know, what's the trajectory? At what point is the cloud going to be more expensive than being on premise, right? But I think that we have a criteria as every project comes to us, we really assess, well, where is the data, right? So that matters. Where is the data? What's the latency of the data? How's the data going to be used? I mean, you have this whole checklist to tell you, is the cloud going to be the right solution for you, or will an on-premise environment be the right solution for you? And so, you know, more and more, because we started in the cloud, the only answer was the cloud, right? Yeah. But now as people are maturing in the type of analytics they do and the demand of that data and the latency of that data, it's telling us to bring it on premise. So I really think you have to take the use case and then apply it, as Greg was saying, then you apply it against your framework to help you come up with the best answer.
Okay, all right, yeah. And both of you all have made great points that, you know, in the past, there were some, you know, cool things happening in the cloud that people were drawn to. And not that there aren't still cool things happening in the cloud, but so many of the things that people were attracted to are now available, you know, on premises. So that's certainly something to consider before just jumping in.
If I could just add one other point.
Yeah.
Within my big data team, we have an innovation and engineering team. And one of the things I would say is if you are in the cloud, don't implement and stop, right? Because your cloud provider is constantly innovating themselves. And so to get the maximum benefit, you have to stay on top of what those new technology or those new feature offerings are as well. We've seen that we've been able to actually reduce the cost in the cloud by shifting and more modernizing that environment with their technology. So I would just say, you know, don't implement and stop. It's an ongoing journey, and really be cost conscious and feature conscious of what's available.
Okay. And I know we're running out of time here. I want to make sure we get to this question. Maybe Jeananne, you can take this first. Can you give us an example of how your company or how Western Digital Solution has solved a data challenge for a real company, and maybe it's a data challenge for Western Digital?
Yeah, so I would go back to the beginning. When we first started, we had 16 manufacturing locations throughout Japan, all of Asia, India, Israel, and the US. And the real challenge was the silos of data, but more important to that was the silos of knowledge of that data. So bringing all the data to the cloud was only step one. Understanding that data in the cloud was a whole different challenge because everybody only knew their part. And when I talk about the factories, it's kind of the components that build up to a drive assembly that build into, so everybody knows a piece, right? And so I would say the biggest solution that we brought forward was knowing how to knit the data together such that if you're in research and development, you have access to the data that you need at the time that you need, if you're in low volume manufacturing, high volume manufacturing, et cetera. And that then opens up the opportunity to solve everybody's problems because they're looking at it from their perspective and they're looking at it from their tooling or they're looking at it from their process optimization. But again, I think bringing the data to the cloud is, you know, people talk about a data lake and it gets really dirty really fast. The harder part is knowing how to structure unstructured data into an environment that really is accessible and provisions the data the way the people need to access it. So I think that's a real problem we had. As a matter of fact, our whole project for the big data platform had one objective: eliminate the data search parties. That was the objective. After that, it was show us the DNA of the drive. But the number one was just eliminate the data search parties. So I would say that was our real company challenge, and that's how we solved it.
Yeah, that sounds like a great challenge to solve. I've been on those data search parties before, so I would love to be able to eliminate those. Greg, can you give us an example?
Yeah, I can do a quick one. There's an aircraft parts manufacturer that I was talking to. This is about 6 months ago. And the way they used to manage their data and their infrastructure, for them, they were doing a lot of dev test changes to their ERP system. You know, it's really important to manage all those parts and pieces and how it all worked. But for them to get a dev test copy of the application with the database, it would take over a day. You know, they'd have to get a VM provision, go to somebody else, get the application, get a copy of the database. They brought in Nutanix and changed their data platform, so that provided some efficiencies, but also having some tools that are in there for automation and application lifecycle management. So they were able to reduce that time to get a copy of the application down to just an hour. And so that really changed the velocity of the business and the impact they could have for what they were doing for their line of business constituents from the IT side.
Wow, I like that. So some great examples there. Thank you all very much. We have so many good questions here. We aren't going to be able to get to all of these. Before we go, I mean, we'll have to do this again sometime. We had so many great questions and there's still some in the queue. I apologize to those folks who asked those. We're not going to have time to get to all of them, but we got lots of great questions. I want to remind everyone to download the handouts there in the GoToWebinar control panel because Western Digital has provided us with a really cool infographic with lots of data points about data that you should check out. And then Nutanix has a really cool definitive guide to hyperconverged infrastructure that you want to download. So make sure you download those as well. And then before we go, we have 3 $100 Amazon gift cards to announce. I have to look over here. Those are going to Matt Trout of Pennsylvania, Patty Corteliu of Colorado, and Arlene Fudelier of Texas. Congratulations to all 3 of you. We'll reach out to deliver your gift cards. And I want to extend a special thank you to Greg and Nutanix and to, excuse me, and to Junan of Western Digital. Thank you both very much for being on the event today.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience for joining us. Hopefully you learned a lot. I know I did about data. It's been a great event. I hope you have a great day and see you next time.